Well, good morning, everybody. If I stand here, I hope I will not be completely obscured by the screen. I'm very pleased and honored to be speaking to you today, partly because I think this potentially is a very significant event in the history of Chilean education, but also because for me it's an opportunity to become familiar with yet another system of education, yet another model of thinking about a qualification framework. And as always, when you come into a country with which you're not very familiar, you're struck by a combination of two somewhat opposite things. On the one hand, Chile has a very distinctive education system, a distinctive context, distinctive traditions and distinctive processes and challenges. On the other hand, a lot of things are familiar. There is an awful lot about Chilean education that echoes, that resonates around the world. And it's this contrast between, as it were, the familiar on the one hand and the different and the distinctive on the other that I find is so fascinating about international comparisons. It also means that although there's an enormous amount of international experience, as Mrs. Lemaitre was saying, of national qualification frameworks around the world, and therefore there's enormous scope for learning from other countries' experience, it must be learning that we're talking about and not borrowing and not copying. And in order to learn from other countries, we first have to understand how they differ, how the contexts differ, and how national qualification frameworks may differ. So I'm going to start off by saying a bit about how the contexts differ and how our national qualification frameworks differ. I'm very grateful for Mrs. Lemaitre for actually summarizing a lot of this and said a lot of what I'm saying echoes what she said. I'm rather pleased about that because there are some quite abstract ideas in here and sometimes a little bit of repetition may help. I hope to add one or two little points to what she said, but she made a very good explanation of some of the main differences. I'm then going to take two examples reflecting the first two of the three models that she described. Scotland as an example of a communications framework, and then rather more briefly I'm going to talk about Ireland as an example of a reforming framework, and then I'll have some concluding comments at the end, including what I suspect is a very rushed and ill-informed comment on one or two aspects of the Chilean situation. So to start off with the conceptual framework, Mrs. Lemaitre referred to a number of definitions of a qualifications framework. In 2007, the OECD conducted a very large study of qualification systems for lifelong learning. And this is the definition that it produced. I'm just going to read the first sentence. A qualifications framework is an instrument for the development and classification of qualifications according to a set of criteria for levels of learning achieved. Two comments on that. First, it refers to development and classification. These are quite different processes. You classify existing qualifications, you develop new ones, or you might develop existing ones to make them somewhat different. And that tension between those two processes is one of the themes I will cover. Also, it says according to criteria for levels of learning achieved. Well, of course, many qualification frameworks are about much more than levels, although levels tends to be the sort of the common element which they all tend to possess. The quotation, I won't read it through, but it then goes on first to discuss ways in which qualification frameworks may differ, and then it concludes by saying all qualification frameworks, however, establish a basis for improving the quality, accessibility, linkages, and public or labour market recognition of qualifications within a country and internationally. So there you've got this same theme, the similarities and the differences. Qualification frameworks differ, but they all try to address at least similar set of challenges. I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. Okay, so how do we understand those differences? First, and absolutely crucially, before you start thinking about a qualifications framework for Chile or indeed for any other country, you need to reflect on the nature of the country itself, the national context. Frameworks tend to work best in smaller countries. They tend to be most successful in countries where you have a policy culture that is reasonably centralized, reasonably uniform, that tends to involve consensus and partnership. They need a policy context where there is a considerable amount of expertise on qualifications on the various aspects of the design, in particular qualification frameworks and the technical issues involved with defining outcomes and defining levels. Then, of course, there are aspects of the education system which are very important. It helps to have an education system that's well developed. It also helps to have an education system with fairly uniform institutions. Very diverse, very fragmented systems are harder, but of course they're the ones that might need the framework most. So again, there's a tension in there. Again, depends on the nature of the labour market, how well organised it is, the role of the formal and informal sectors. And crucially, it depends on what a qualification actually means in the country concerned, and that, of course, can vary across different sectors. Are they seen primarily as indicators of what people have learnt, or do they have some other, perhaps more sociological, perhaps more distributional role that is largely independent of that? So the national context is absolutely essential, and the first thing that you need to do if you were thinking about a framework for Chile would obviously be to reflect on, well, what is it distinctive about the Chilean situation, which, including those headings there, which might make it rather different from other countries. Second, as Mrs. Lemaitre mentioned, frameworks vary in their scope. There are sector frameworks which cover either a particular sector of the education system, like higher education, or possibly a particular sector of the labour market, a particular occupational area or industry. And then there are comprehensive frameworks which include all learning. And actually, even within comprehensive frameworks, it's quite useful to distinguish those which focus mainly on the formal mainstream education system, and those which also include all types of learning, including non-formal, informal learning, and obviously including prior experiential learning. One way which is very helpful, and I shall be coming back to this, of thinking about a comprehensive framework is that many of them, you can think of them as a lot of sector frameworks with an overarching framework that links them together, and that's the comprehensive framework. And actually that's true of both of the two frameworks I'm going to describe later, and that's probably true of a majority of comprehensive frameworks across the world. Again, there are a number of design features that can vary quite significantly across frameworks. Scotland, I think, has the record number of levels with 12. Other countries have fewer levels. How those levels are described, the processes that Mrs. Lemaitre described of trying to define levels in terms typically of knowledge, skills, and competence, or some variation on that theme, that can vary. In Germany, for example, they do it on the basis of a much more holistic concept of professional and personal competence. Some frameworks identify and distinguish fields of study or types of qualifications, some don't. Some include credit as an inbuilt part of the framework, like the Scottish one, others don't. Some are tight, have very precisely drawn rules or criteria for what types of qualifications can fit. Others are loose and much more open. Quite importantly, the role that learning outcomes play in a framework can vary quite widely. I've made a distinction between what I've called outcomes-led frameworks, where the learning outcome is seen as the main factor that's driving the way that the network tries to intervene into the education system, and outcomes-referenced frameworks, which use learning outcomes as an important part of the architecture of the framework, but only as part of it, and makes much more reference to, for example, professional judgments and experience and other criteria for allocating qualifications to the framework, and doesn't rely upon learning outcomes to drive the change. Again, I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. And again, frameworks vary very much according to how they're led, the roles of the stakeholders. Are they regulatory or are they voluntary? Are they top-down? A lot of frameworks across the world are really driven by a ministry or a government agency. Some, a few, are bottom-up, and most are some sort of compromise between the two. And then, of course, frameworks, not surprisingly, vary according to their purposes and according to how frameworks try to achieve them. And just to comment briefly on possible purposes, and again, not all frameworks try to achieve all of these purposes, nor is this necessarily a complete list. but frameworks may aim to improve the understanding of the learning system as a whole by enabling you to relate different qualifications to each other and the different parts of the system to each other. They can be used to increase the coherence and coordination of that system. They can be used to promote access to that system or to encourage transfer and progression between parts of the system, between different pathways, between different institutions. They can be used to help to recognize existing skills. They can be used as an instrument of accountability or control or regulation. Very often they're used to update and extend standards, or perhaps more crucially, to make those standards more consistent across different parts of a diverse or fragmented system. They can be used to enhance the quality of learning. They can be used to make education more responsive to the demand, whether from employers or learners or others. They can be used to promote mobility. And very often they can be used to link the national qualification frameworks to a transnational framework. And indeed, if you look at many of the European frameworks that have been developed, all European Union countries are now trying to develop a framework. In many cases, the immediate reason they wanted to do so was because it was seen to be the only realistic way in which they could link their own qualifications to the European qualifications framework. And they saw that as necessary in order to remain as sort of full members of the European education and labour markets. Of course, having got that purpose in mind, they then, of course, found other useful things to do with their framework. That's a fairly familiar list. If you read the books on frameworks, the guides, the manuals, they'll all come out with a list that at least is similar to that. Sometimes they'll refer to sort of broader aims, which you might call second-order objectives, such as promoting lifelong learning, or even, as in the case of the first South African framework when it was introduced, promoting social and economic transformation. What you will see not quite so often is an attempt to try to say what are the mechanisms by which qualification frameworks, what are the change processes which qualification frameworks introduce by which they hope to achieve those purposes. This is a very abstract list, and I hope I can at least illustrate a little bit of it later on. But I've suggested that there are at least 7 mechanisms, 7 change processes. I don't like the term mechanisms. It sounds too mechanistic, as qualification frameworks are not mechanisms. First, qualification frameworks introduce the common language of levels, the language of outcomes, the language of credit points, the language of types of qualification, perhaps. If different people speak the same language, it's easier to coordinate their activities, even if they're not actually speaking to each other. So a common language is a precondition for introducing a more coherent system for some of those objectives like access and promoting progression. Many qualification frameworks, in fact, most qualification frameworks, are perceived to have improved stakeholder engagement and coordination. The very fact of trying to develop a qualification framework means that you have to bring people around the table who may not have met very often around a table before. In Europe, many countries found that the qualifications framework was the first occasion on which many of their vocational education and training institutions actually met with higher education institutions in a constructive way, actually planning educational policy. But of course, stakeholder engagement and coordination is also a means of fulfilling a number of those other objectives that I just referred to. Frameworks, perhaps most simply, many frameworks are regulatory. In order to put your qualification in that framework, it has to meet certain conditions, and so the framework itself is the instrument of regulation. And closely linked with that, and of course this is an important theme of this conference, many frameworks are very closely linked. I think all frameworks will be linked in some way or another with systems of quality assurance. And sometimes they provide, as it were, some of the conceptual tools for that system, as well as some of the regulatory and governance context for that system. Many frameworks involve the unitization of qualifications, and again, this can be seen as a way, for example, of trying to make the system more flexible and more responsive. Unitization is often seen as a precondition for effective credit transfer processes. So again, unitization is another mechanism often associated with frameworks by which they might try to achieve their outcomes. 6, frameworks, and Mrs. Lemaitre described this in some detail, typically try to make individual qualifications more transparent, make it easier to know what the qualification represents, typically through the learning outcomes approach. And that, again, is a way by which, for example, the learner can have more control over education, can know better what it is that they're signing up to if they're entering a course, that users can know what a qualification represents, makes it easier to plan routes between different qualifications. And finally, and perhaps rather nebulously, qualification frameworks may rely upon cultural change to achieve their objectives. Now, I've gone through that list in detail because, again, I think this has relevance to how any one country approaches a qualifications framework. Which of those change processes a Chilean framework or particular sectors of that framework would rely on will depend on the Chilean context. In Europe, some political scientists say that there are three principles by which governance can operate: markets, networks, and hierarchy. They respectively can be associated with different change processes. Market processes tend to refer to making individual qualifications more transparent. Networks might involve stakeholder engagements. Hierarchical models of governance are more likely to proceed through regulation. So again, thinking about the context, thinking about how the change processes would fit in with that context. Also, it depends on the time scale you're thinking of as well. Some of those things, like cultural change, can take decades, if not longer. Mrs. Lemaitre has saved me a bit of work here because I was going to talk about, or I will still just briefly mention, the three types of framework, which are a way of trying to bring together some of those distinctions I've just been talking about in more detail. And although in a moment I'm going to suggest that you need to treat this typology with a bit of caution, nevertheless, it's helpful for thinking about possibilities. And so you've got the communications framework, which starts from the existing system, describes it, and aims to make it more transparent. Itself does not drive change, it's a tool for change. Other things need to drive change. At the other extreme, you've got the transformational framework, which starts from where you're trying to get to, the future system, and it aims for radical change, and it tries to drive that change. And in between the two, you've got a reforming framework, which starts from the existing system, and does a lot of the things that the communications framework may try to do, but does try to do a bit more as well. It recognizes there are parts of the system or aspects of the system which need more radical reform, and it tries to be the driver for those reforms. But I've talked in terms of the other extreme, and of course you might want to think about this distinction as a continuum. On the one hand, you've got, at the left-hand end, you've got communications frameworks which describe the existing systems, are tools for change, have a loose design, are outcomes referenced typically in the way that I've described it, don't rely centrally upon learning outcomes to drive the change, and they're usually voluntary. And on the right-hand side, at the other end of the continuum, you have transformational frameworks, which, as it were, do the opposite. But, and here's an important point, and it'll come across, I think, when I talk about the Scottish and Irish cases. NQFs, comprehensive national qualification frameworks, are not homogeneous entities. As I said, most of them can be understood as embracing a number of different sub-frameworks or sectoral frameworks. Nearly all NQFs, national qualification frameworks, vary across those sub-frameworks, and also between the sub-framework and the overarching framework, which is usually looser and less specified. Also, and quite importantly, an NQF framework may vary over time. And they can vary in different directions. A lot of the European frameworks are consciously being designed as communications frameworks because that's the easiest part of the process. You get them established, then you might want to use those frameworks for somewhat more radical reforming objectives. There's another point of view which says, well, actually many frameworks move in the opposite direction. They start off as reforming frameworks because there are reforms that they want to make. When you've made the reforms, then what's the framework left to do? It's just describing the system that it has already reformed. So it's then a communication framework. So, and of course, frameworks can be, different parts of a framework can vary in different directions. So that typology of frameworks is a very helpful way of thinking about the possibilities, but in practice, it's more complicated, there's variation within a national context. Okay, so having introduced, as it were, the conceptual map of how frameworks can differ and how their context can differ, I'm now going to say a little bit about the Scottish Credit and Qualifications Framework, which is probably the best example, or at least one of the oldest examples, and therefore the example for which we have most experience of a communications framework. First, and importantly, I need to say a little bit about the national context. As you may know, this time next year, Scotland will know whether it's going to remain as a part of the United Kingdom. It's going to have a referendum next September to decide whether it wants to become an independent country. It probably won't, but we'll see. It has a separate education system within the United Kingdom, and in a sense that is largely self-governed already, although obviously within the constraints of being part of a single state. It's a small country, population of 5 million, and it has uniform institutions. We basically have one type of public university. Schools, basically one type of comprehensive school. A lot of the other features of the Scottish system are fairly uniform and easy to understand, with the principal exception actually of the qualification system. It has a policy-making culture that is reasonably consensual, centralized, involves partnership to quite a significant extent, although in a fairly sort of hierarchical way. And in Scotland, since, well, at least 1983, so 30 years ago, there's a reform called the Action Plan. I won't describe that in detail, but just to make the point that we've had 3 decades in which we have been reforming different parts of the education system and the qualification system. And as a result of that series of reforms, the SCQF was able to incorporate 3 sort of fairly well-developed sub-frameworks as they have now become. So there's a framework that embraces higher education degrees, including, for example, a credit transfer system that was already in operation before the SCQF, before the overarching framework came along. And again, there's been a series of reforms which have led to a much more coordinated and unitary framework for the qualifications that schools and colleges prepare for. And there's a third sub-framework of competence-based occupational qualifications called SVQs, Scottish Vocational Qualifications, which are very similar to the national vocational qualifications, or NVQs, which are awarded in England, which I know have been very influential in some areas in Chile. And of course, those reforms basically provided the overarching framework with something to build on. And the main emphasis of the overarching framework was therefore to bring them together and to coordinate them, not to develop further within the frameworks, although obviously that might be needed as well. So there are pressures for a more unified system, for bringing these sub-frameworks together. And all of those circumstances helps to make the case for a communications framework a fairly powerful one. Right. I won't try to take you through the map. That's the standard map, if you look on the website, that you'll find now of the Scottish Credit and Qualifications Framework. The point I simply want to make is that it's a grid with a number of cells with well-recognized names of qualifications in them, and it's communicating. It's mapping these qualifications against 12 levels on the left-hand side, and what effectively are the different sub-frameworks along the top. So, what about the framework? It's designed as a comprehensive framework. It links those 3 sub-frameworks, although it also wants to include all other types of learning as well, not just the mainstream qualifications. It's loose. The conditions for being, the conditions which a qualification needs to meet to be in the framework are not tightly specified, although they are for some of the sub-frameworks. It has 12 levels, and those level descriptors, I won't describe this in detail, are based on 5 characteristics of learning outcomes, which roughly speaking map onto knowledge, skills, and competencies, which is the famous trinity of the European qualifications framework. And it incorporates credit. All qualifications in the framework have a level, or their component units might have different levels, and they all have credit points, measures of the volume of learning. The purposes of the system are fairly modest. primarily sort of a communications function to make the system as a whole easier to understand, to promote access, and to promote progression and transfer between parts of the system. And the change processes, referring back to that, those 7 types I referred to earlier. In particular, introducing a common language, the levels, the credit points. Unitization, not all, most qualifications are based on units. And the SCQF at least is engaged to a fair extent in bringing the stakeholders, the employers, different types of educational institutions into the fold. It's quite a powerful sort of committee structure that tries to do that. It was formally launched in 2001, implemented from 2003, although, of course, a lot of the elements of the framework were there already. It's voluntary. No qualification has to be in it, and it's led by the owners of the qualification sub-frameworks. The main bodies are responsible for awarding the qualifications within those frameworks, and that includes the universities. It also includes the SQA, the Scottish Qualifications Authority, which awards school and college qualifications. It also includes the body that is responsible for quality assurance of university programs. It now includes the college sector as well, which offer the main sort of post-school opportunities outside of the universities. Interestingly, other organizations, as of a few years ago, have been able to become so-called credit rating bodies, which effectively means they are empowered to put qualifications in the framework. They're the gatekeepers, together with the main leaders of the sub-frameworks. In order to become a gatekeeper, they have to demonstrate a commitment, good quality assurance processes. And it's significant that most of these credit rating bodies are there because they are credit rating their own qualifications. An early example was the Scottish Police College, which trains policemen in Scotland. It produced its own qualifications. It wanted these qualifications recognized in a national context by the SCQF, and it applied to become one of the first bodies that applied to become a credit rating body, which empowered it to place its own qualifications in the framework, and in order to do that, it had to demonstrate that it had the right quality assurance processes. As for the implementation process, a familiar theme that's coming up, it's been slow. A lot of emphasis in the early years was on getting the mainstream qualifications together, the school and the college and the university ones. Some of the qualifications outside the main sub-frameworks were rather put on one side and took much longer to get in. The partnership has a very, very small bureaucracy. It still only has about 8 or 9 people actually working in the main SCQF partnership executive. Most of the power, most of the action lies with the partners, the stakeholders involved. But it was strengthened in 2007, so it has more powers of taking the initiative. And crucially, the Scottish framework has, although it's progressed fairly slowly and sometimes frustratingly, it's retained stakeholder support, particularly compared to many other frameworks around the world, support from higher education, which of course partly reflects the fact that higher education is helping to lead the SCQF, the Scottish framework. How is it used? A lot of institutions use it as a tool for developing their own programs. My own university, Edinburgh University, about 8 or 9 years ago, restructured its curriculum, and it did so in terms of the levels and the credit points of the SCQF. And of course, that process can similarly be extended to when different institutions get together in order to plan provision. Where you have, for example, different colleges, different institutions serving an area, they can use the SCQF to map what they're doing to make sure that there aren't any gaps. And again, they can use the SCQF to see whether, as a tool for planning progression routes and transfer between different programs. An important development in Scottish education is a very strong pathway from higher vocational education into the universities, and that is based around the SCQF, based around credit transfer using the SCQF. It's, to a growing extent, being used for the recognition of prior learning. That's the Scottish term for a whole range of processes. More recognition than accreditation. It can be used for guidance. Some employers use it to manage their own workforces, to assess the skills of their workers, to plan career progression, for recruitment and for various sort of training functions. Nevertheless, most of the evaluations of the SCQF have said that, well, it has a lot of potential uses. The actual uses are not quite so great. So there's still a lot of uses still to be realized. And the phrase that's often used when you do an evaluation is, it's a useful tool. It's something to have around there, and it's helpful. But actually using that tool requires other things to drive the process. So just to sort of sum up, the SCQF has been broadly successful, but that success does need to be related to the fact that it started off with fairly modest aims, and also that it built on earlier and sometimes much more radical reforms. Some of the earlier reforms that created the sub-frameworks certainly fitted the reforming framework type, possibly in some cases the transformational framework type. Much of its impact has, I think, been achieved, this is my personal analysis, by becoming the national language. That the fact that increasingly educational provision is being planned and understood in terms of levels, SCQF levels, in terms of the credit points and so forth. And of course, even when you're not actually, when people are acting independently within an education system, but if they're using the same concepts, the same tools, the same notions of levels, for example, to plan their provision, that means there's a sort of process of increasing coherence that's almost built into the system. So establishing a national language, I think, is extremely important. Interestingly, the SCQF has had more impact in the education system than in the labour market. Recently, we were doing a large study as part of a multicultural, multi-country study of credit transfer. When we spoke to people in the education system, they all said, yes, the SCQF is very useful for enabling us to plan these transfer routes. When we spoke to the employers, they said, SCQF, what's that? Or possibly some of the large employers knew much more about it, but the sense was that it wasn't really for them, it was more for the education sector. And that's something you find in quite a number of evaluations and studies of qualification frameworks. And also in the same study, we said, well, actually, a framework has to recognize and to take account of the fact that there are important barriers which stop you from having a completely seamless system in which anybody can go anywhere and move anywhere. There are barriers to do with different types of learning. You can't just transfer credit between learning that is qualitatively different. There are institutional barriers, all sorts of reasons why institutions might be reluctant, for example, to grant credit in this case. And more broadly, there are political barriers. We're talking about a process which potentially affects the position of powerful interests, powerful institutions, and that process will meet with resistance. And also, as with other frameworks, but especially communications frameworks, the evidence from the Scottish case is that the framework needs to be part of a broader policy strategy. On its own, it's not going to achieve very much. It needs to be part of this broader strategy. I'm now going to say something much more briefly about the Irish qualifications framework, mainly because quite a lot of it echoes the Scottish experience, but there are one or two differences. And again, the Irish context has many features in common with Scotland, small country, fairly similar sort of policy processes. And in Ireland, there have been a number of reforms which have established, or at least in the process of creating sub-frameworks for universities, non-university higher education, general education, primarily talking about schools there, and what's called further education and training, which is, in a sense, most things that happen after school that aren't the non-university higher education or universities. And so, as in Scotland, there were pressures to try to bring these sub-frameworks into a more coherent system. But in contrast to Scotland, those sub-frameworks were less developed at the time when the Irish framework was introduced. So in other words, there was still more to be done in developing the sub-frameworks themselves, in developing in particular the further education and training sub-framework, and to some extent the other three as well. Another interesting feature about Ireland, which is possibly more pronounced than in Scotland, is that the European influence has been strong. Ireland's a small country, whereas Scotland at least has the United Kingdom as a sort of larger body within which, for example, to establish the credibility of its universities. Ireland is more dependent upon the Bologna process, which is the unifying framework for higher education in Europe, as a way of establishing its position and possibly of gaining recognition for its degrees. And the well, I mentioned this because the Bologna process and the need to be going along with it was quite an important influence, I think, on the Irish universities in wanting to join in with the process of developing a framework. It recognized that it was valuable to it. The universities recognized that being part of this framework would help them establish themselves internationally as well as within the countries. And all those factors, I think, point to the choice of a reforming framework. So it has a number of things in common with Scotland, but it's trying to do a bit more. It's a comprehensive framework, fairly loose. It has 10 levels rather than 12, and with level descriptors for knowledge, skills, and competence. It distinguishes different types of awards, types of qualifications. Within the framework, there are built-in guidelines for quality assurance and for access, transfer, and progression. And within two of the sectors, the further education and training and the higher education and training sectors, it's a regulatory framework. Qualifications have to comply with these conditions. And it's that in particular, and by virtue of complying, they therefore have to conform with the guidelines of quality assurance and for access, transfer, and progression. And it's that in particular that makes me class this as a reforming framework. It's actually trying to intervene into those two sub-frameworks more directly. And so its purposes, in a sense, it was trying to do the same sorts of things as in Scotland, but additionally it was trying, rather more than in Scotland, to raise standards, to enhance quality of learning, and broadly to change cultures. And likewise, the change processes it was relying on, to some extent the same as in Scotland, but in addition, for parts of the system, it was relying on regulation as a way of trying to achieve its objectives. It was relying more than in Scotland, I think, on quality assurance as a way of trying to achieve its objectives. And it's relied more upon cultural change. Whether it's achieved that is another question. Interestingly, this maps onto the logo you see down there. This is the famous Irish rainbow diagram, whereas the Scottish one I showed you was a boring rectangle grid. This one's a rainbow. And it doesn't put the high qualifications at the top, it puts the high-level qualifications down at the right-hand end and the low qualifications down at the left-hand end, although I don't think people are fooled. Again, it's mapping the qualifications, it's demonstrating where they are. I won't go describe it in detail. The coloured bars across the middle actually refer to the sub-frameworks. So the sub-frameworks cover different parts of, different ranges of levels within the overall framework. And at the top, round the edge, you've got the familiar names of the certificates, the qualifications, which everybody recognizes to help them to understand it. It was launched in 2003. As I've described, it built on earlier reforms, which were still continuing. It was initially led by a single National Qualifications Authority of Ireland, together with separate councils which awarded the qualifications and also were responsible for quality assurance in the sub-frameworks. Well, not quite the same in the school and university sectors. Last year, after quite a long period of discussion and planning, at the end of last year, these merged into a single body. So you have a single body, Quality and Qualifications Ireland, responsible for essentially managing the qualifications framework, for awarding the qualifications many of the qualifications in the different subsectors of the framework, and for quality assurance across the framework. And it's still in the process of sorting out exactly how it's going to deal with the different sub-frameworks. But what I think this means is that, to begin with, the emphasis was very much upon developing the sub-frameworks, developing the sectors. Now the emphasis is much more upon how you bring them together, how you integrate them. A lot of the issues that were discovered early on had to do with people moving between the sub-frameworks, the differences between the sub-frameworks. As in Scotland, stakeholder engagement, I think, has been fairly effective. Okay, and conclude a number of issues. NFQ, incidentally, is the Irish acronym, National Framework of Qualifications. It's been reasonably successful. I mean, I think it's been at least as successful as the Scottish one, given that its aims were more ambitious and it started from a somewhat different point. But, a familiar story, the implementation's been slow, the impact's been slow, and the impact has been variable across sectors. Schools have barely been affected until about 2 or 3 years ago by the framework. They are now going through a period of curriculum reform, and I think this will actually bring them into line. One reason for that is that schools in Ireland, as indeed in many other countries, are obsessed by the application process for higher education based on a centralized higher education process where people basically have to maximize the number of points they receive through their end of school leaving certificate, and that's used to distribute university places. And of course, the philosophy that underlies that system is rather different from the philosophy that underlies the National Qualifications Framework, which is much more about recognizing what you've achieved rather than ranking you. It's been slow to integrate the sub-framework, so that I think is now changing, and there have been issues to do with whether the language has differed across the sub-frameworks, whether the criteria have been similar. But more generally, there's been a concern. A few years ago, I was a member of a team that conducted a framework implementation and impact study, and we found a lot of people saying, well, all these sort of cultural changes, all these changes in teaching, learning, changes in raising the status and the value of students, they've been rather superficial. Not much has really happened. We also discovered anomalies in how existing qualifications have been placed. I say anomalies, but actually they're what you might call pragmatic, politically wise decisions. For example, all apprenticeships are placed at the same level of the framework, although a more sort of technical analysis would suggest that they would cover 2, probably 3 levels. And another familiar theme, the impact of the framework needed strong drivers, strong factors from somewhere else, strong influences from somewhere else to make them to be realized. For example, one of the things we argued for as a study team was that the government ought to back the framework by making sure that its own recruitment, its own public recruitment, was strongly framed around, used the framework as criteria and the framework as a reference. And also, of course, that funding should follow the framework. Okay, so I just want to conclude with 2 sets of comments. First, when we did that study, and this was actually drawing on not just the Irish experience, but also the Scottish experience, and the other international member of the team was Francis Kelly from New Zealand, so we had New Zealand experience represented as well. We suggested that there was actually a common model of change which should guide or influence many frameworks. And of course, Mrs. Lemaitre's presentation, I think, echoed quite a lot of these points. But the starting point, of course, is that a national qualification framework isn't simply a technical instrument. It's a social construct. It's socially and politically determined and shaped. It's not just about getting the levels right and getting the technical decisions right. It's about trust. It's about understanding. It's about culture. I just mentioned it's about pragmatic compromises. That means that if you're introducing an NQF, you need long time scales. It takes a long time for all this understanding to build up, for trust to develop, for culture to change especially. It needs stakeholder involvement and partnership again in order to create those same conditions. It needs a loose design, but also a design that can vary across the different subsectors and sub-frameworks. I apologize for this term. I use the term iterative alignment, by which I mean the process of introducing a framework is an iterative process, it's an incremental process, step by step. Some of those iterations consist of a mutual adjustment, a process whereby the framework changes a bit. Then what actually happens in the world of education and training, in the learning world, changes a bit to match the framework. Then the framework changes a bit again to match what's going on in the real world. So it's this coming together of the framework and practice. And again, Mrs. Lemaitre, I think, described that process very effectively. Also, and I think the Irish and Scottish frameworks provide a contrast here, it needs to find the right balance between developing within the sub-frameworks and integrating across the sub-frameworks. Scotland was largely about integrating across the sub-frameworks. Ireland at least started by being more about developing within them. And finally, I've introduced 1 or 2 rather ugly English phrases, at least, into the language of qualification frameworks. Another one is policy breadth, by which I mean a framework on its own is not a particularly powerful instrument. It has to be part of a broader policy or reform program in order to make it work. I hesitated before putting this one. I have to admit, I did last minute this morning revise my presentation. Here are 1 or 2 comments, and I apologize if I've offended everybody. what you might want to think about. Well, most of these are actually very obvious questions, and the questions that other people who've written about frameworks or commented about frameworks would ask as well. What are the objectives? Are those objectives the same for the different sectors that you're looking at? Could those objectives be achieved by other instruments in a qualifications framework? Will they change? Can you anticipate more different objectives in a few years' time? What is your timescale anyhow? This is a long-term process. You're not talking about something that in 2 or 3 years' time is going to be finished. How would those objectives be achieved? I won't go back to talk about the change processes, but which of those change processes would actually work in Chile? And of course, the answer might vary across different sectors, across different sub-frameworks. What would the immediate priority in Chile be? Would it be trying to bring together the different sectors of the education and training system, the different qualification sub-frameworks? Would it be about trying to develop the individual sectors or sub-frameworks? Would Chile be able to introduce a voluntary, comprehensive framework? Would the various stakeholders and institutions join in? What would be their incentive to do so? How could you create incentives to do so? What would be the consequences of their not doing so? One that good thing about Scotland, and I think Ireland, I've tried to suggest this, is that actually, both because of the culture, but also because of the self-interest of institutions, a voluntary framework works because people want to be part of the national system. Do institutions in Chile want to be part of a national system? Are the employment stakeholders as engaged as those in education? And how engaged and how coherent, how unified are the education stakeholders in Chile? I'm conscious that you have a very differentiated higher education system. In Scotland, higher education has, if you want to be cynical about it, stopped the framework from doing any damage to its own interests, precisely because it's been in a position to lead the framework, but it was only able to do so because it could speak with a united voice. Would the same be true in Chile? And similarly with respect to other sectors of education. And finally, I've just said, and all the evidence suggests that frameworks only work as part of the broader policy program. Okay, what would that broader policy program or reform program look like in Chile? What would it be? Okay, thank you very much.